And up now it is, I don't know if it's recording yet. There we go. Now it's recording.
Yeah.
Okay. Welcome everyone to this week's weekly video from WeThink. Just to recap, weTHINK.eu is an all-online strategy group that's developed to make working groups on a number of different subject matters and bring together key stakeholders in each of those subject matters to discuss best practices, share their knowledge, experience, and education so that they can come up with solutions and, like I said, best practices. Since early 2021, weTHINK.eu has been developing the UAV, UGV, and now I suppose all unmanned systems working group. And with that working group, we are aimed at bringing together the same set of people, the researchers, the practitioners, the manufacturers, the policymakers, all of the key stakeholders, in the hopes of discussing what the emerging threats are, identifying them, exploring them, and then developing solutions and best practices and strategies for how we can deal with them. And one way we've been exploring that is through an iterative series of war games that are all online. And we've just completed phase 1, which was a red team, blue team scenario. And we use that based off the CIA's kind of psychology of intelligence analysis guru, Richard Hewer's strategic analytic technique, tradecraft primer, which has red teaming as one of the key ways of analyzing information, converting into intelligence and challenging hypotheses. We're now launched phase 2, which is live since Monday, and it's being shared out only through email because we're trying to avoid any kind of contamination through bots or anything else through social media. So for all of those who are interested in taking the survey, it's about 40 minutes to 60 minutes, and it's based on crowdsourced intelligence, which is a relatively new kind of disputed discipline in the field of intelligence and in the intelligence community. And it's designed to develop a number of potential threat vectors that we can use to inform our red team in phase 3. And so I have with us today Sean, the newest member of our team. I don't know if he's been on our last video, but Sean is also a fellow research manager and also project manager. If you just want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. My name's Sean Fisher. I'm coming to WeThink with a background in project management from Villanova University, and about 12 years of military experience as an intelligence analyst, and specifically focusing on fixed wing manned ISR platforms for the U.S. Army, and also just a personal interest in non-state actor threats, and especially their use of unmanned vehicles, kind of just looking at emerging trends and really trying to understand what's happening in this sphere ecosystem. So yeah.
And we also have Zak Kallenborn. If you want to give yourself an introduction, he's been a big help in this project so far.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So I'm Zak Kallenborn. I'm a policy fellow at George Mason University, a research affiliate at START at the University of Maryland, an officially proclaimed U.S. Army mad scientist and a national security consultant. I write about autonomous weapons, drone swarms, weapons of mass destruction, and WMD terrorism. Have about 50 plus publications everywhere from Brookings Institution to Parameters to War on the Rock, Defense One, and a myriad of others. My research has been covered in New York Times, BBC, Wired, NPR, and a variety of others. And thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for both of you for joining us. So I guess today we're talking about the importance of this war game series, and I think what we're seeing in Ukraine specifically and in conflicts around the world, this kind of, to use a term that I'm pushing a lot. I don't think I came up with it, but I like to use it, which is it's arguably terminology is arguable, but I use the term democratization of connectivity, information, and technology. And that's basically the increased accessibility and availability and of technology, information, and connectivity, and how easily ideas are shared. And I think if we look at conflicts in Libya, in Syria, in Yemen, and specifically in Ukraine, we're seeing that a whole lot of people from various backgrounds, whether it's different countries that are coming from foreign fighters, various violent non-state actors, different ideologies, are all connecting together, sharing ideas, learning from each other, and developing new kinds of sort of DIY technologies that are capable of reshaping conflict as we've known it. And I think the importance of this second phase of the war game is that we're trying to develop the widest threat matrix possible so that we can kind of have a big pool of threat vectors to look at and work with our partners from various different international law enforcement agencies, multinational security and defense organizations, and the other key stakeholders that we have in the WeThink project. And so I kind of wanted to discuss that because we have specifically in Ukraine this kind of laboratory, I think I've said it before, of like unmanned systems, but specifically commercial off-the-shelf UAVs and CUAS systems, and now external state actors providing military grade or reverse engineered versions of other militaries' UAVs to both sides in the conflicts, or whether they're state or non-state actors. And we have people that are coming from different parts of the world that are learning how to use those. They're getting valuable combat experience. And I think at some point, maybe those people will come back or they'll move to different conflicts, or this could reshape the way that modern conflict looks like. So in that sense, I think it's important that we have as much possible from a threat vector and threat matrix perspective. But at this point, I want to turn it over to you, Zach. What's your opinion on that? Because I know earlier, before we started, we kind of discussed this question of there's 2 points. The original point, what I just said, and then later on we can talk about the, in my opinion, I think it's a case of when rather than if. And I think that was the second point we wanted to discuss. And maybe Sean, what's your perspective on that as well? So Zach?
Yeah, so I agree about the point about sort of the broad threats space. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges you get with drones is that really they are just a platform, which theoretically you can put anything you want on it. That could be a bomb, it could be a chemical agent, it could just be camera, it could be a thermal, it could be like, infrared sensor. Pretty much anything you could possibly imagine, which means theoretically you could go after anything you could possibly imagine, assuming, of course, that it is relatively useful. And I think that's sort of the larger question that we get at is to what extent are drones, particularly when it comes to unmanned systems, non-state actors, more or less useful than other forms of attack. Since a non-state actor is going to look at it as one set of possibilities against many others, how exactly do we compare drones against, say, a suicide vest or a car bomb? And to me, the fundamental issue that we're seeing across these conflicts, as well as non-state actor use, is that, at least particularly when it comes to aerial drones, is the big advantage you get is that access to the air. You can fly over a bollard, you can fly over a fence, you can get access to areas that you might not otherwise. You don't get to get up to the 10th story of a building without actually having to, Spider-Man your way up there. And I think that's the real utility. Of course, the trade-off is that you get that limited payload. That is, these drones are relatively small compared to, say, a big truck or like a semi or, a car. So is that the question for many of these terrorists is it worth that increased access versus that alternative?
And do you think why hasn't it happened? Yeah, like why haven't we? We've seen how effective it's been in Syria. Like how relatively simple it is to ascertain through logistics fairly anonymously the materials. Anything like, I mean, people are even talking about, they could stick COVID, on it, and the agricultural UAVs, and just start spraying it in a populated area? Why hasn't it happened yet?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple elements to it. So the first is that it's a relatively new technology, and terrorists tend to be pretty slow to innovate because naturally terrorists have fairly high risk thresholds. I mean, if they're carrying out attack, they're risking their life, quite literally. Either like, will they be killed, or will they be life in prison, that type of thing. So they want to make sure that like it's going to be effective. So there's a tendency to stick with like dated, reliable technologies. Like statistically, I think like guns and bombs have just always been the most used terrorist weapon, just like throughout history. That hasn't really changed much. And that said, I think you're right that like we are seeing this rapid increase, and I think we can expect to see some greater increase. But the thing is that drone terrorism is necessarily downstream from all terrorism, right? And if we look at sort of terrorism in general, at least in the United States, there hasn't been all that many. Like there have been a few recently, and they've been tragic when they happen, but there's been relatively few. So necessarily drone terrorism will be even fewer than that. And conversely, that sort of gets back to the point I was making earlier that a big part of it is what's your alternative? And is that alternative as good or better or worse than the particular drone system? If I'm a terrorist, I don't necessarily need a drone. I can, go pick up a butcher knife and just go stab people if I wanted to. Or say just get in a car and just drive over a bunch of people, or get a gun and just shoot up a bunch of people. Those are all really easy things to do, and they can potentially cause significantly more casualties. Well, not necessarily significantly more, but they can cause potentially significant casualties, I will say, without necessarily experimenting with new technology.
I suppose it'd be interesting, like with the rise of right-wing extremist groups as well. Like a lot of these groups have military training. They're either former, current, or active duty, and in almost every manifesto or attack plan that has been taken when someone's been arrested, they've always mentioned targeting critical infrastructure, which is much more, it's a different line than the mass violence that we would be thinking of, Takfiri groups or jihadist groups. And I suppose unmanned systems would provide a much more effective way of doing that when you're thinking about, in military terms, trying to mitigate the risk to your limited personnel. And do you think there's a reason why we haven't seen that yet, or is there a greater risk?
Yeah, so I think there's sort of two elements to that. So first, there's that sort of military training and sort of the availability of knowledge and experience. I think that's an important trend, and especially as militaries increasingly integrate drones. If we have folks with military training who worked regularly in a combat role with a drone, that's going to be a fairly logical thing for them to start incorporate. And not only to actually just carry out attacks, but just for simply ISR. I think we saw in the Christchurch shooting, for example, that the shooter originally used the drone to conduct surveillance on, I think it was, I don't remember if it was a mosque or a church, but I think it was a mosque. But either way, used the drone to conduct surveillance. Certainly, as you have folks more familiar and more comfortable with that technology, they may increasingly turn to it. So I think the trend is there over the longer term. But to your point about critical infrastructure, again, like that's sort of, it's inherently downstream from like, okay, all attacks on critical infrastructure, right? And all terrorist attacks. That said, I think there are some real concerns there, and trying to understand them is really critical. And that goes back to that trade-off issue, particularly given that access to fencing or to the air to sort of get above physical ground-based defenses, and that trade-off with small amounts of explosives. So the question, I think, from a security perspective is where are the places in critical infrastructure where a small amount of explosive could potentially do significant harm, and where are the things that normally we wouldn't consider as like threats because like terrorists couldn't really get access to them very easily, but might be able to do so now. And I don't want to go into too terribly specifics, but I'll just look at a couple examples, real world examples that we've seen. So the first one we saw the Gatwick Airport incident, and I think it was 2018, something like that, where a couple unknown drones were flying around the airport, and they shut down the airport for I think a couple days, grounding like thousands of flights. I'm not sure I want to say that example because I'm going to flight later this afternoon across the ocean. So I don't really know if I want to bring that up, but I do think it's a good example of a potential threat vector that could be really significant and novel because airport security has been built for the past couple decades around a 9/11 style attack. That is, everything is focused on the checkpoint. But if you have a drone, you can sort of attack anywhere around the fence line. So how do you think about security is going to be very different. And likewise, you don't necessarily need all that much payload on a drone to create some pretty considerable harm to an aircraft. Imagine, say, what happens if a drone goes into just an engine, even if it doesn't even have an explosive, that could create some pretty significant harm. So I think examples like that. The other one I would note is there was the Abqaiq attack, and I think it was 2019 in Saudi Arabia, where a mixture of drones and missiles, ostensibly from the Houthi rebels, but I think we've concluded that Iran was actually responsible, carried out attacks on the oil refinery over there, very precise, narrow strikes. And that's another example where, you have a really expensive piece of equipment that's normally not all that accessible, particularly, I think the places that were hit were relatively on the top side of the containers. But a terrorist doesn't typically have access to missiles. Houthi rebels are a potential counterexample of that, but for the most part, your average terrorist does not have that. But having a UAV, they potentially have a very simple missile, so they can potentially hit targets like that they might not otherwise. So I think it's an important threat to consider, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think there's going to be a lot of innovation coming from all these conflicts, like with the connectivity, with Twitter and social media, everything, TikTok. There's even TikTok channels like the Russian army or the Ukrainian army showing rapidly, whether the information is accurate or not, but they're showing these ideas almost instantaneously, and that's hitting the global audience, right? So it's now like an exchange of ideas. It's a flow of ideas that are coming out to inspire more people to say, oh, wow, I didn't think about that, like. Or I think of the thing as simple as, remember, if anyone is old enough to play Grand Theft Auto 2, the one that was from the bird's eye view, where you would have the RC controlled car that had a bomb on it. It was like a little remote control car, and then you would just drive it under a car and it would explode. I mean, that's effectively a UGV. Like, you cut a hole in a fence in an airport, and there's a lot of airports that just have chain link fence, and you could drive one of those things, right under an airplane, and that would blow up how much, I don't know, would it blow up how much jet fuel? But I mean, like, I don't want to give anyone ideas, but some guy comes up with something as simple as that, they post it on TikTok, and it gets all over global media, and then what can it spiral, other variations. And I think that's what's so interesting about the state that we're in right now, in conflict, global conflict. And also what will be interesting about this survey, to see the kind of wide variety of respondents and what they're going to come up with. It's especially, I think, what's so important about this. And I would encourage, again, I'm pushing this, but I would encourage as many people to take this as possible, because so we can get ahead of these kind of threats and think about them and start discussing them. But I guess there's two more points. One, I love to rail about the KSK, which is the German Special Forces unit that was arrested in 2018 or 2019. That was an actual Special Forces unit in the German military that had a day X plan to basically do a military coup, and had weapons caches and everything like that. Like, this is, and then there was this guy in Belgium, Koenigs, who was identified as having right-wing extremist tendencies. He was removed from training special operations, or some elite units, and then he was put in charge of the armory. And what did he do? Well, he had his day where he finally snapped, and he stole a bunch of heavy machine guns and RPGs, and he put in the back of a car, and he drove off. And fortunately, he took his own life rather than using all those things. But it took them weeks, multiple armies and law enforcement agencies, weeks to find his body. So imagine these type of guys going to Ukraine or going to other places, or playing around with UAVs, coming up, having access to this material, having access to these places, these facilities, to this intelligence. And that's something that I would be really concerned about in the near future, as this kind of personality is on the rise, this kind of movement is on the rise. And on the US side, the January 6th thing, we see a whole lot of evidence of people with military experience. if there had been more of a organized plan at the end there, and imagine if someone had brought UAVs or UGVs into that situation, it would be a very different story, I imagine. So I guess I just still wonder, how is it how, in your opinion, how is it a an if scenario still?
Yeah, well, actually, I want to give Sean a chance to weigh in. I don't want to
Yeah.
occupy the full conversation.
Yeah. No, yeah, I think there's a lot of examples. One thing that keeps coming to mind is just looking at Ukraine and the Wagner Group's recruitment of out of Russian prison systems. So you have these organized crime elements that are now engaging in full scale combat in Ukraine. This foreign fighter movement from Syria, from Libya, moving into those spaces. And I think what you just said, Philip, is important. Is like that this is a growing trend, and we see it across the West, but it's also something that's ongoing in the East as well. Drones are being used in Burma. We see drone usage in the global South, in Brazil, in Mexico, by cartels. And so I do think when we look at drones, kind of like what Zach said, is the drone is a platform or a force multiplier. And then we look at other force multipliers like social media, the quickness as to which information spreads. And then I think also 3D printing is an interesting aspect to drone conflict from non-state actors. And so you have all of these force multipliers kind of coming together at a time in which there's a growing trend of individuals that are engaging in this stuff, either as true believers in some sort of movement, or simply looking for power, money, some sort of criminal element to thing. And so I do think on the crime side, we have seen drone usage kind of increasing, right? Smuggling into prisons. I recently read about a drone that was used to infiltrate a building and then push a button to open a door to allow people from the outside in, right? I read about a drone used to conduct a cyber attack directly on top of a building that was otherwise inaccessible and stuff. And so we see it in crime. Me personally, yeah, I think it's a matter of just when does somebody put the pieces together to carry it out? When does somebody when do these things kind of come together? And I would say it would be incorrect to think that people aren't looking for this or aren't moving to this. There's a growing movement that I see in the U.S. from like a Minuteman kind of movement in the Second Amendment community that is really pushing for the democratization of skills from a active or formerly serving like military members to civilians, law enforcement. There's a big crossover and a blending that's occurring. I at least that I see here in the States, and I imagine in other places, that it's really is, to me, a matter of when this happens. So I would really be interested in your thoughts, Zach, on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting question, like whether it's sort of a when or an if. And I think the answer is to some extent both, because, and in fact, that's actually why I believe that the war games like this are really important, because the range of the potential applications are so broad. When it comes to some simple things like, is someone going to try to drop a bomb from a drone in the United States? Yeah, I buy that. Seems more of like a when, not an if. Like we've seen lots of states and non-state actors do that quite frequently. It's not terribly difficult. So if we talk about that specific type of scenario, I think it strikes me as quite likely, almost certain, but I'm always have a little bit of doubt about anything in particular. But that said, because we have these range of potential activities, there certainly are some that I think are likely to be rarer and potentially in questionable whether they happen. So we talked a little bit about the potential for, say, releasing a biological or chemical weapons agent from a drone using, say, a pesticide drone. I think that's a concerning scenario. That said, any drone-based use of chemical biological weapons is again downstream from any terrorist use of chemical and biological weapons. And we know that historically that's been pretty rare, and terrorists are typically pretty bad at it. And often it gets more attention than actual harm. So it seems conceivable to me that some non-state actor sometime might look at pesticide drones. In fact, we know that Aum Shinrikyo, the apocalyptic cult in the 90s, they did actually look at using UAVs for, I think it was chemical weapons dispersal, but they ultimately concluded it wasn't really a good approach. So I buy that theoretically that could be done, but certainly it's going to be harder and certainly comparatively much less likely than, say, a drone dropping a bomb. Conversely, like we can also imagine the potential for, say, using actual drone swarms, that is, a bunch of drones together linked with communication architectures using collaborative behaviors. States, absolutely. In fact, they're already using those in combat. But non-state actors, I think, is plausible, but at least less likely in the near term, precisely because of that matter of risk and to what extent they actually understand the technology. That said, a big caveat there is how that technology changes and how that commercialization looks like, as we've seen some growth in, say, like swarm in a box type technology, where you kind of have a bunch of drones already just integrated together from a commercial perspective. If technologies like that become ubiquitous and at scale, then I think absolutely drone swarm becomes more of a when, not an if. But in the short term, it's far from clear that that's going to actually happen.
Yeah, I don't want to keep you too long, but I just had two last points. You reminded me of the chemical spraying of the use of drones for chemical spraying or disbursement of some kind of irritant. And I think actually just recently at the rallies in Brazil, the Lula supporters were allegedly sprayed by Bolsonaro supporters that had agricultural drones like the quadcopters spraying human fecal matter and something like these events. And as disgusting as it was, it's like people kind of dispersed. Some people were laughing about it, but it seemed like it wasn't too much of a panic. But there's a case of it happening. Imagine if it was something else, like a different, instead of just human waste, something like, I don't know, CS gas or something like that would cause much more damage, something like a chemical weapon. But then also I'm thinking with these swarms, CUS seems to have a lot of gaps. Like we don't have a standardization for what success is. We don't have a lot of opportunities for live testing because of regulation. And I get the regulation because when it comes to active measures, you don't want to bring down an airplane or jam a bunch of communications and screw up an economy and cost multi-millions of dollars of damage just to test it. But the problem with it is that that the swarm, I'm just thinking, like, imagine if there were a number of different drones with different operating on different RF channels hitting a CUS system, would it be able to manage it? That's the kind of information I think we really need to know from the CUS companies to come together. Like, are they capable of managing, obviously not publish it, for the whole world to see, but are they capable of managing basically one RF channel, or is it GPS spoofing? How many drones can they handle? Can they handle the swarm? If you have a swarm of varying different types of drones at different altitudes, different radio frequencies, different speeds, will it be able to, even if it's multi-layer, deal with it? And will the active measures, because as far as I've seen, active measures are basically someone coming out with a jamming gun in most places. How are you going to be able to manage a swarm? So, and I know they really had a massive effect on a Russian airbase in Syria. So that's big questions, but
I have some thoughts, but I'll let Sean take the first crack.
Yeah, I think the point of a swarm is that kind of massing of fires, right? And the whole point is overwhelming whatever countermeasures there may be. I think I think it is I don't know. I think I would want to know what the drone companies and the counter UAV companies are thinking. We're thinking of this kind of massing of material in an aerial sense, but what does that also mean from like a maritime sense, or on the ground as well? And like what does countermeasures across the board look like? I think is an important question to be asking, because what you do with a drone in the air, you can easily do with a drone in the water or on the ground, depending on what the infrastructure or what the target is. So I think those are important measures, and I think the reason why swarming is kind of really that applied future from both a state, at least from a state-based perspective now, is because the countermeasures are so limited to what you can do. It's just that massing that is overwhelming situations and stuff, and we've seen those successfully used. Zach.
Yeah, I think I agree. That's a critical challenge. And I'm happy you brought up maritime swarming, because that's actually what I'm flying out this afternoon to go talk about. So that should be kind of fun. But so I think that's an important issue. In fact, we just saw that in Ukraine. While it wasn't a true drone swarm, we did see a mass drone attack in, I think it was the Black Sea, if I recall, with mixture of drone boats and drone aerial drones all operating together. Well, I think that's going to be more difficult from a non-state actor perspective. It's certainly at least plausible. We, at least for the higher end actors, we've seen, for example, the Houthi rebels have carried out fairly significant drone boat attacks, just single ones. But theoretically, if they just made a few, they could probably integrate it using communication. They could potentially have a swarm, or just generally mass drones, which you don't necessarily need to have that communication to have effect there. When it comes to countermeasures, I agree. I think there's an open question about like what actually works best, especially when you're looking at multi-domain swarms, or just drones in general. Because the reality, as far as I can tell, although there's been tons of research into countering unmanned aerial vehicles, I've struggled to find any serious research looking at countering unmanned ground vehicles, unmanned surface vehicles, unmanned underwater vehicles. And I don't know that it's necessarily requires that much thinking. I mean, a unmanned ground vehicle, you can just pray to St. Javelin and just blow the crap out of an anti-tank weapon. Like, doesn't necessarily need to be all that sophisticated. But thinking about the complexities of, say, how those integrate with different UAVs, whether, say, it makes sense to jam the signal between them. Do you focus on, say, the aerial drone, the counter vehicle, or the ground vehicle? What's the most cost-effective way to actually do it? I think that's an open question, and that's also, I think, why things like these sort of wargamings are important, to try to understand the sort of spectrum of threats there, because ultimately, no matter what we do from the countermeasure perspective, it should be risk and threat informed. That is, although I think swarms are an emerging threat that are very important, it's also clear that that's not like your typical capability at this point. So, should we do R&D? Should we explore the possibility? 100%, absolutely. Do we need to suddenly put an order for billions of dollars in counter swarm equipment and then deploy them for every unit and facility in the world? No, I think that's not exactly a sensible approach. But trying to do those assessments and being aware of where that's headed is important. And I would finally add that I think when it comes to that countermeasure threat, or connecting threat to countermeasure, it's similarly understanding where those real vulnerabilities are. Where are the places that we actually are really concerned about, so that we can put those assets where they really need to be, and where the things we, have that actual concern. And I think there's also going to need to be some level of conceptual redesign around how we think about these systems. The problem with some of these drone attacks is that they move, at least with aerial drones, that they move incredibly fast. With some of these like faster racing drones, you're getting up 80 miles per hour. So one of the challenges there is that, at least in the United States, the law currently only allows federal authorities to operate counter UAS systems. So if I'm a, say, critical infrastructure operator, at an airport or a oil refinery, and I see a drone coming in, and I have to call up the cops, be like, oh, hey, I think there's a drone threat, I think it might be threatening, could you all come over here and check it out? They're gonna get someone in the car, travel them over there, and I'm like, all right. But by the time they've done all that, like, the drone's already there, it's hitting the target, it's blown up, and damage is done. I should caveat that I believe in the current national plan, they are looking at changing that and allowing the Biden administration is allowing, I think, TSA to operate federal, allow COAS systems, which is wonderful. But I think that problem still extends to all of the critical infrastructure. And to the degree we don't really know yet where those real risks are, I think it's incumbent to think about new solutions, such as like autonomous systems, which is or remotely operated systems, which is what I favor. So you have something on, the area that's operated from afar by some federal official, and that way you don't necessarily need to have that same time delay. But that's a larger question. And certainly, I think just generally there needs to be new thinking about how we conduct counter drone measures.
Well, thanks, guys. I don't want to keep you all. I just want to leave with a couple of points, last 2 points for the rest of us to think about. Again, I think this phase 2 is really important because we need the diversity of perspectives. And I think that's a value of crowdsourced intelligence, or CROSIN, because unfortunately, it seems like we have a lot of homogenous kind of populations making up the discussions on unmanned, even they use the term unmanned systems. So I have seen some reports where there are more women involved, but we need a more diverse set of people that are bringing thoughts and perspectives so that we can come up with more diverse solutions. And I think that's what's so important about this phase 2, that we're getting people outside of not just in the CUAS, the UAV, the uninhabited systems world, but also reaching out to universities and advanced education students in a whole range of disciplines, because we need to get all the different angles. And I think that's the best way we can come up with problem solving. And especially when we're looking at, I think Dr. Stephen Wright from UW Bristol, he was saying that the Soviet era, the Cold War era technology cycle was about 10 years. Now with the drone cycle, it's about 6 months of the change in technology. And I imagine with everything that we're seeing now, it's probably cut even more. So that's, I think, imperative for these kind of exercises to be happening frequently so that we can keep up with the changes, that we can keep bringing in diversity of perspectives, and we can keep having these discussions. So on that point, just wanted to thank you both for coming in. And I know we went a little bit over, but it was a great discussion, and we have some ideas for the next one. So I hope you all have a lovely week and a lovely weekend. And thanks again for coming on. And I'm going to try hit stop recording so it's not awkward with us looking at each other for a few minutes. And thanks again. Take care, guys.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you, Zach.
Likewise.
Nice talking to you both.
Indeed.